coastal command of the Royal Air Force, now under Admiralty control, the Royal Navy did well against U-boats in 1939 to 1940, the winter of the phony war on the European continent. German moored magnetic mines and surface raiders proved more destructive than submarines at this period. The Royal Navy quickly learned to cope with these and passed on its findings to us, which enabled the United States Navy to repair its former neglect of mine warfare. Up to mid-1940, it was the general opinion in the United States that the French Army and British Navy between them could defeat Hitler. The blitzes that Hitler exploded in the spring of 1940, culminating in the fall of France in June, administered a rude jolt to this attitude. It took time for the implications to sink into the public mind, but we now know that the fall of France was the greatest upset to world balance of power between 1871 and 1949, when China went red. With Germany in control of such French outposts as Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and La Pallice, her U-boat's cruising radius was doubled, and the air blitz laid on England at the same time carried the grave threat of Hitler's acquiring bases in the British Isles. If North Africa too were brought under German control, there was a fair prospect that German authoritarian governments would be set up in South America and the French and Dutch West Indies be taken over. Naturally, there were repercussions in the Far East. The Tokyo press reacted violently to the United States holding its annual fleet exercise in the Pacific. At the conclusion of this 1940 fleet problem, and at the request of the State Department, the fleet was ordered to remain based on Pearl Harbor, in the hope of its exercising a deterrent effect on Japanese aggression. The imperial government had already proclaimed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, aiming at Japanese political, economic and military hegemony over Indochina, Thailand, Netherlands East Indies and the Philippines. On 27 September 1940, Japan formally joined the European Axis in the Tripartite Pact, which stipulated that if one of the three got into war with the United States, the other two would pitch in. For the United States Navy, this posed the problem of fighting a two-ocean war with a much less than one-ocean fleet. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had a political calculating machine in his head, an intricate instrument in which Gallup polls, the strength of armed forces and the probability of England's survival, the personalities of governors, senators and congressmen, and of Mussolini, Hitler, Churchill, Chiang and Tojo. The Irish, German, Italian and Jewish votes in the approaching presidential election, the help the Allies' people and the American firsters, were combined with fine points of political manoeuvring. The fall of France, fed into the Franklin D. Roosevelt calculating machine, caused wheels to whir and gears to click with dynamic intensity. Out came a solution. The short of war policy 1, to help keep England fighting in Europe, 2, to gain time for American rearmament, and 3, to restrain Japan by diplomacy and the fleet's deterrence. Whether Roosevelt really believed that this policy would keep us out of war is debatable, but he had to assume that it would until after the presidential election of 1940, in which he flouted tradition by running for a third term, and until events abroad convinced the American people that war was their only alternative to a shameful and ultimately disastrous appeasement. In any case, an essential and most beneficial part of the short of war policy was to build up the Navy. On 14 June 1940, the day that Hitler took Paris, President Roosevelt signed a naval expansion bill that had been under discussion for months. 3 days later, Admiral Stark asked Congress for $4 billion more to begin building a two-ocean navy, and got it. The Navy then had about 1,250,000 tons of combatant shipping. This bill authorized a more than double increase, but as Admiral Stark said, dollars cannot buy yesterday. For 2 years at least, the Americas would be vulnerable in the event of a German victory in Europe. To meet this emergency, President Roosevelt adopted the political strategy of helping England and, after June 1941, Russia in their war with Germany. This meant violating all the old international laws of neutrality. Hitler had completely flouted neutral rights by his invasion of Denmark, Norway, Belgium and Holland. Hence, Germany forfeited the right to demand neutrality of others. Most Americans were loath to discard a concept so deeply rooted in the national tradition. They had just been trying to embalm neutrality in acts of Congress. But they were willing to build a two-ocean navy, hoping that a wall of ships in the blueprint stage or on the building ways would deter Hitler from setting up satellite states in America. On 15 June 1940, the day after approving the first of these new Navy bills, President Roosevelt appointed a group of eminent civilian scientists, members of a new National Defense Research Committee. These included Vannevar Bush, president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, James Bryant Conant, president of Harvard University, Carl T. Compton, president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Frank B. Jewett, president of the National Academy of Sciences, and Rear Admiral J. A. Fuhrer. Since late 1939, Dr. Bush had been working on the mobilization of American scientists for war, but it took the fall of France to bring matters to a head. From this National Defense Research Committee stemmed most of the essential civilian research done for the armed forces during the short-of-war period and during the war itself. At the same time, in order to emphasize the nation's danger and obtain nationwide support, President Roosevelt appointed two leading Republicans Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of War. Frank Knox, who had been Republican candidate for vice president in the last election, quickly acquired a grasp of naval business and became one of the best secretaries the Navy ever had. The office of Under Secretary of the Navy was created and first filled by Knox's future successor, James V. Forrestal, on 22 August 1940. Henry L. Stimson, who had been Secretary of War under President Taft and Secretary of State under President Hoover, became Secretary of War again in July 1940. Upon his urgent recommendation, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act on 16 September. This was the first time that the United States had adopted compulsory military training in time of peace. During the summer and fall of that year, President Roosevelt initiated several important steps in high-level strategy in the Atlantic. He held a conference with Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada, in August. A United States and Canada Mutual Defense Pact included complete reciprocity in the use of the naval shipyards of both countries. Now that the British Commonwealth was the one power fighting Germany, it became urgent to keep her strong and pugnacious while the American two-ocean navy was being built. President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill concluded on 2 September the naval bases destroyers deal. Britain ceded to the United States sovereign rights for 99 years over sites for naval, military and air bases in the West Indies, in exchange for 54 stack destroyers built during or shortly after the last war. The Argentia, Newfoundland and Bermuda bases were also granted to the United States as free gifts. Information from United States naval attachés in the Axis countries furthered the short-of-war policy. For instance, Commander A. E. Schrader reported from Berlin on 18 December 1940 that Hitler already had 7 to 9 million men available to be called to the colours, that there was no possibility of an internal revolt against him, that all 6 of the occupied countries were being systematically plundered for Germany's benefit, and that the British heart of oak was admirably taking the German air blitz on a chin of armour plate. He even predicted that Germany would next attack Russia to annex the Ukraine and the Caucasus, and warned that the whole world would be an empty shell if Germany won. One of our military attachés in Berlin obtained a copy of Hitler's plan for an attack on Russia 6 months in advance. The important news went to Stalin via Roosevelt and Churchill, but Stalin refused to believe it. Post-war revelations of discussion in the German High Command prove that President Roosevelt's estimate that Hitler would overlook direct American aid to England rather than declare war was absolutely right. The arrogant German authoritarian government chose to accept the destroyer deal and plenty more, because it knew very well that the United States at war would be far more formidable than the United States short of war, and the time gained by us for preparation was of inestimable value. The next unneutral measure was Lend-Lease. By existing neutrality legislation, it was still illegal for American merchant ships to trade with, or for private investors to lend their money to belligerent countries. Whatever war supplies Britain or Canada procured in the United States had to be paid for with cash and carried in their own ships, and they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. The Lend-Lease plan was briefly this. The United States would embark on an all-out military and naval defense program, both by giving orders to private firms and by building new government plants, but it would lend or lease as much production as could be spared to Great Britain. Congress passed the first Lend-Lease Act on 11 March 1941. This decision, said the President on 15 March, is the end of any attempt at appeasement in our land, the end of urging us to get along with the dictators, the end of compromise with tyranny and the forces of oppression. It was not quite that, certainly not respecting Japan, but the German authoritarians had to take it. Hitler, who attacked Russia in June 1941, informed his Navy chief in July that it was vitally important to put off America's entering into the war for another 1 or 2 months. He wanted no incidents calculated to provoke America, but he got plenty, as we shall see. Even more important in early 1941 was the ABC-1 Staff Agreement, which constituted the basic agreement for Anglo-American cooperation if and when we entered the war, and the basic strategic decision of the war, to beat Hitler first. In July 1940, Admiral Harold R. Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, sent Rear Admiral R. L. Gormley to London for exploratory conversations with the Admiralty. These were so fruitful in acquiring information about anti-submarine and other aspects of the war that on the advice of Chief of Naval Operations, a secret staff conversation with the British was convened at Washington at the end of January 1941. Rear Admirals Gormley and Richmond Kelly Turner and Captains Allen G. Kirk and DeWitt C. Ramsey represented the United States Navy. Major General Embick, Brigadier General Sherman Miles, and Colonel L. T. Garrow, the Army. Air Vice Marshal John C. Slessor was there for the Royal Air Force, and Rear Admirals Roger Bellairs and Victor Danckwerts for the Royal Navy. After long deliberations, this conference concluded the ABC-1 Staff Agreement of 27 March 1941. This provided that if and when the United States entered the war, it would exert the principal United States military effort in the European theatre. America would try to avoid war with Japan, but, even if that proved impossible, operations in the Pacific would be conducted in such a manner as to facilitate the effort against the European Axis. Naturally, this decision pleased the British, but the Americans initiated it. The reasons behind so sound a decision, which, as Slessor wrote, continued to govern our combined action throughout the war, although at times a bit frayed at the edges, were 1. Germany had a far greater military potentiality than Japan. 2. Germany already controlled almost the entire Atlantic coast of Europe and threatened the Americas. 3. England was already fighting Germany and could be assisted immediately, whilst Japan at that time was fighting only China, which foreign aid could not reach, Japan having already seized the Chinese coast, part of Indochina, and the Burma Road. The two staffs also agreed that if and when the United States entered the war, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and the British Chiefs of Staff would meet as the combined Chiefs of Staff to make strategic plans and decisions for the Allied nations, and other decisions about command structures, areas of responsibility, and exchange of information were loyally carried out on both sides. Thus, even before America entered the war, the basic strategic decision had been made, and machinery had been set up for close cooperation. This forehandedness prevented an infinite amount of friction, misunderstanding, and fruitless effort, such as had taken place in World War I. One Washington agreement went into effect immediately, that the United States Navy share responsibility for escorting transatlantic convoys as soon as the Atlantic Fleet could do so. The Atlantic Fleet was reactivated, 1 February 1941 under Admiral Ernest J. King as Commander-in-Chief, Sinklant for short. Ernie King, born in Ohio in 1878, a graduate of the Naval Academy in 1901, was not only a great naval officer but a military strategist. He had shown outstanding ability in almost every branch of the Navy: ordnance, engineering, assistant chief of staff to the commander-in-chief in World War I, logistics, submarines, naval aviation, general board, commanding officer of a reefer, of destroyers, of a naval air station, and of Lexington. A hard man with little sense of humour, he was more respected than liked in the Navy. His eagerness to get things done quickly with no unnecessary palaver, coupled with an abrupt and often rude manner, infuriated many Americans and dismayed his British opposite numbers. No officer on either side or in any armed service had so complete a strategic view of the war as King's. Neither General Marshall nor any of the British had time or energy to concentrate on the war in the Pacific, but King not only grasped that and the Atlantic War, He had a better strategic savvy of the land phases of the European war than most of the generals. Secretary Stimson hated him, Winston Churchill and Sir Alan Brooke hated him, Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham hated him, many even in the United States Army and Navy hated him. But Tojo, Hitler and Dönitz had even greater reason to hate King, because with Churchill, Roosevelt and Eisenhower, he was a principal architect of Allied victory. By the time the short-of-war measures were being organized, German U-boats were coming in increasing numbers off the assembly line, enabling Admiral Dönitz to set up new wolfpack tactics. His submarines, in groups of 8 to 20, were sent out fan-wise into the North and South Atlantic, and daily controlled by radio from the command post in Lorient, would shadow a convoy by day and attack by night. On the night of 3 to 4 April 1941, one of these wolf packs sank 10 out of 22 ships in a slow transatlantic convoy. Admiral Stark at once saw that the United States Navy would have to pitch in to help escort of convoy, or the Lend-Lease aid would never reach its destination. On 4 April, he transferred the new carrier Yorktown, 3 battleships, 4 light cruisers, and 2 destroyer squadrons from the Pacific to the Atlantic Fleet. On 9 April, the Minister of Denmark, now occupied by the Germans, at Washington invited the United States to become the protector of Greenland, which she promptly did, and Greenland became a base for weather stations and for airfields, both important in the anti-submarine campaign. On 18 April, Admiral King issued his Operation Plan 341, in which he ordered that any belligerent warship or aircraft, other than those of powers which had West Indian colonies, which approached within 25 miles of the Western Hemisphere, Greenland included, to be viewed as actuated by an intention immediately to attack such territory. The fleet was ordered to be in constant readiness for combat, but to make no attack without orders from Chief of Naval Operations. In May came the breakout of German battleship Bismarck, sunk after a long chase by torpedo bombers and gunfire of the Royal Navy on the 27th. That day, President Roosevelt declared an unlimited national emergency. The decimation of transatlantic convoys by U-boats continued. Hitler invaded Russia on 22 June. After a tardy invitation from a sulky Icelandic government, United States Marines occupied Iceland on 8 July. The United States Navy formally began escort duties by protecting merchant ships, of whatever flag, in convoys from East Coast ports to Iceland. On 16 September, the Navy began helping the Canadians to escort transatlantic convoys to a mid-ocean meeting point, Momp, south of Iceland, where the Royal Navy took over. First blood for Germany was narrowly averted on 20 June 1941, when U-203 sighted battleship Texas between Newfoundland and Greenland, and, assuming that she had been lend-leased to England, tried to attack but could not catch her. On 4 September, United States destroyer Greer and U-652 played a cat-and-mouse game with depth charges and torpedoes. Both missed, but the President took this occasion to have orders issued to shoot on sight any ship interfering with American shipping. It worked both ways. On the black night of 17 October, USS Kearney, one of Captain Hewlett Thibaud's destroyer division escorting a slow convoy, was torpedoed. She lost 11 men but reached port. On 30 October, a naval oiler, Salinas, was torpedoed in mid-ocean but survived. The first sinking of a combatant ship came next day when USS Reuben James, Lieutenant Commander H.L. Edwards, was sunk by U-562 while helping to escort a fast convoy from Halifax, with a loss of 115 officers and men. Thus, short of war was not so very short for the Atlantic Fleet. Autumn and winter escort work in the North Atlantic was arduous and exhausting for men and ships. That section of it covered by United States destroyers, between Newfoundland, Greenland and Iceland, is the roughest part of the Western Ocean in winter. Winds of gale force, mountainous seas, biting cold, body-piercing fog and blinding snow squalls were the rule rather than the exception. The continual rolling and pitching, coupled with the necessity for constant vigilance night and day, not only for enemy attack, but to guard against collisions with other escort vessels and the convoy, wore men down. The so-called rest periods at Valfjorda and Argentia were rests merely from enemy attack, not from the weather, for in both ports the holding ground was bad and the weather terrible. Destroyers dragged all over these harbours in winter gales, and vigorous effort was required to avoid fouling other vessels and running aground. The strain was not only physical but psychological. These officers and men were enduring all the danger and hardship of war, yet it was not called war. They were forbidden to talk of their experiences ashore, or even to tell where they had been and what they were doing, and so had none of the satisfaction derived from public recognition. After going through cold hell at sea, they would reach port to find other young men making money in safe industries, and college football stars featured as heroes of the day. Barroom isolationists and, it is suspected, enemy agents worked on the men in Boston, taunting them with fighting England's battles and tempting them to desert. But our bluejackets had seen for themselves the new terror that the German authoritarian had added to the perils and dangers of the deep. Few realized better than they the threat to America in this German strike for sea supremacy. And the fact that morale in the destroyers remained high throughout this period of bitter warfare that yet was not war attests the intelligence, the discipline, and the fortitude of the United States Navy. As we have seen, the United States fleet, commanded by Admiral James O. Richardson, had been based at Pearl Harbor as a deterrent to Japanese aggression since April 1940. Admiral Richardson, after expressing to the President in no uncertain terms his dislike of Pearl Harbor as a fleet base, was relieved by Admiral Husband E. Kimmel on 1 February 1941, and on the same day the United States fleet was renamed the Pacific Fleet. It was still an unbalanced fleet, incapable of promptly performing its assigned mission in the revised Orange, now called Rainbow 5, plan of capturing key points in the Marshall and Caroline Islands with the help of the Marine Corps, and then relieving the Philippines. There, it was assumed, the army under General Douglas MacArthur, who was also Field Marshal of the Armed Forces of the Philippine Commonwealth, would be holding out against the Japanese. Kimmel, an energetic, devoted naval officer, applied himself to fleet training, both of ships and planes, so as to provide a corps of experienced officers and petty officers for the flood of new construction that the two-ocean navy and other recent acts provided. He frequently sent out task groups to exercise the men and the guns, but he made a practice of mooring most of the fleet in Pearl Harbor over weekends to keep officers and men happy. It must be remembered that the average young American of that era, conditioned by 21 years of anti-militarist indoctrination by movies, books, preachers and teachers, could be induced to enlist in the armed forces, or re-enlist if his term had expired, only by making things pleasant for him, not too much work and plenty of recreation. That situation, besides the 2,000-mile haul for supplies, was why Admiral Richardson objected to the fleets being based away from California. The situation in Oahu of the United States Army, responsible for the defense of the territory, was similar. Lieutenant General Walter Short had 2 divisions under his command. He too was deeply concerned with training and replacement. Flying fortresses, B-17s as fast as built, were flown to Oahu for their final arming and equipment, after which most of them flew on to Manila via Wake Island and Guam. There seems to have been no expectation that they might be needed in Hawaii. In contrast to the United States Pacific Fleet, the Japanese combined fleet was well balanced, thoroughly trained, and spoiling for a fight, owing to the operation of the 5:5:3 ratio, and to Japan's kicking over even that in 1936 and embarking on an intensive building program. The Japanese Navy was more powerful in combatant ships than these convertible to transports, fleet oilers, or other auxiliaries. It was rugged from annual maneuvers in rough northern waters. Japanese gunnery and navigation were excellent. Their torpedoes were far more speedy, accurate, and destructive than those of any other navy, and their carrier planes were superior in the fighter and torpedo bomber categories. Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, had been attached to the Japanese embassy in Washington, where he was respected for his naval knowledge, and also for his excellent game of poker. Knowing America's military potential very well, he begged Prince Konoye, the Prime Minister who preceded General Tojo, to endeavor to avoid war. But when war was decided upon, Yamamoto set his ingenious brain to work on the best method of neutralizing the United States Navy at the start. He had, in fact, been working on that problem since January 1941, when he decided that a surprise air attack on the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was the answer. The decision, for a man of Yamamoto's intelligence, was strange. For a strategy, it was not only wrong, but disastrous. The Pacific Fleet, as we have seen, had been sent to Pearl Harbor as a deterrent, and as such it was fatally effective. The Japanese warlords had made up their minds in 1940 to take advantage of the European situation and conquer all European or American colonies or dependencies in Eastern Asia. The only deterrents that they feared were the B-17s at Manila and the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In view of the weakness of that fleet, of which they were well apprised, and the length of time that it would take to reach Philippine waters, it is unaccountable that Yamamoto thought its destruction necessary before war fairly began. Apparently, he felt that Japan could not suffer a fleet in being, one of Mahan's concepts, on her flank, even though thousands of miles distant. Actually, the fleet would have been as much of a deterrent in California harbors as at Pearl, but harder to get at. And if we had based it in Singapore, as the British urged us to do, it would have been even more vulnerable, besides being in an impossible position logistically. The Japanese war plan, brought together at a Supreme War Council on 6 September 1941, was as follows. First, prior to a declaration of war, destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet and the British and American air forces on the Malay Peninsula and Luzon. Second, while the British and American navies were decimated and disorganized, a quick conquest of the Philippines, Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, Borneo, British Malaya, including Singapore and Sumatra. Third, when these were secure, the converging of Japanese amphibious forces on the richest prize, Java, and a mop-up of the rest of the Dutch islands. Fourth, an intensive development of Malayan and Indonesian resources in oil, rubber, etc., and, to secure these, establishment of a defensive perimeter running from the Kurile Islands through Wake, the Marshalls, and around the southern and western edges of the Malay Barrier to the Burmese-Indian border. With these bases, the Japanese Navy and Air Forces could cut all lines of communication between Australia, New Zealand, and the Anglo-American powers, which would then be forced to sue for peace. Fifth, and finally, Japan would proceed completely to subjugate China. Over half the world's population would then be under the economic, political, and military control of the emperor. This scheme of conquest was the most enticing, ambitious, and far-reaching in modern history, not excepting Hitler's. It almost worked and might well have succeeded but for the United States Navy. This being Japan's plan, it is astonishing to find her American apologists claiming that she was goaded, provoked, and coerced into making war on us by the Roosevelt administration. What Franklin D. Roosevelt did, with the support of Congress and popular approval, as judged by acts of Congress, Gallup polls, and the newspapers, was to impose embargoes on iron, steel, oil, and other strategic materials going to Japan, and to freeze Japanese financial assets in America. This process, applied gradually, began in mid-1940 and finally reached effectiveness at the end of July 1941, after Japan had announced her determination to occupy southern Indochina. Now, in the second half of 1941, the British and the Dutch cooperated in both freeze and embargoes, and as Japanese oil stocks dwindled, the government found itself in a dilemma. It must either renounce an imposing plan of conquest, on which the army insisted, to get oil from the United States and the Netherlands East Indies, or it must fight the United States, the Dutch and the British to conquer oil for more conquests. It chose the second alternative deliberately, as the more honourable and potentially profitable. Better to defeat America in a quick blitz, as Hitler had France, and then, impregnable, get on with the conquest of China. It is now perfectly clear that nothing short of force could have stopped Japan from embarking on her Southeast Asia plan, or have persuaded her to withdraw from China. But war might have been at least postponed, allowing the United States to catch up somewhat in the arms race, if Prince Konoye's proposal in August 1941 of a summit conference between himself and President Roosevelt had been accepted. Joseph Grew, our sapient and sensitive ambassador at Tokyo, was for it. Franklin D. Roosevelt was for it, but Secretary of State Cordell Hull opposed it on the grounds that Konoye was a slippery character, and that a summit conference should take place only to cap a prior agreement on principles, such as Japan's abandoning the tripartite pact. Hull did not understand that for Japan that treaty with Germany and Italy was part face, part military gesture, and that she did not intend to honor it if it did not suit her. Prince Konoye sincerely wished to start liquidating Japan's dreams of conquest, but he was on a spot with a ministry of Jingo militarists, and Hull gave him no help to get off. As Prince of the Royal House, he had the Emperor's ear, and Hirohito himself was anxious for peace. So there was a chance that if Konoye brought a promise from Roosevelt to lift the oil embargo and unfreeze the assets, in return for Japan's promising to start a military evacuation of Indochina and eventually of China itself, the prince might have persuaded the emperor to expel the militarists from the cabinet. Of course, it is even more likely that Konoye would have been assassinated, but he was willing to take the chance, and he should have been given the opportunity. In any event, a summit conference would have gained time. It could not have met until late October, and Japan could hardly have dispatched the Pearl Harbor striking force while it was sitting. After toying with the summit idea for almost 2 months, Hull persuaded Franklin D. Roosevelt to reject it definitely on 2 October. Konoye then resigned, and General Tojo became Prime Minister. And as the Japanese Supreme War Council had in the meantime set up the grandiose war plan already described, any complete change of Japanese policy would have been difficult to carry out, even by the Emperor. The negotiations at Washington dragged along fruitlessly. On 10 November, Winston Churchill declared in a speech that he did not know whether the effort of the United States to preserve peace in the Pacific will be successful, and he promised that if the United States should become involved in war with Japan, a British declaration would follow within the hour. That threat did not deter the Japanese government for a moment. You can always keep the peace if you are willing to pay the asking price, and it is a matter of high strategic decision whether the price demanded is worse than refusal with its risk of war. Tojo's price for peace, his ultimatum as he called it, was presented by his ambassador at Washington on 20 November 1941. America must concede Japan a free hand in Indochina and China, and render Chiang no more assistance. She must restore trading relations with Japan, and send no more military forces to the South Pacific or the Far East, even to the Philippines. In return for these extraordinary concessions, which could only have been accepted by a nation defeated in war, all Japan offered was to send no more armed forces into Southeast Asia, and to evacuate French Indochina after peace had been imposed on China. Tojo had already twice postponed the deadline at which war would begin if the United States did not knuckle under. Time was running out, and time was what the leaders of the American armed forces, especially General Marshall, Admiral Stark, and General MacArthur in the Philippines, most wanted. Largely to please them, the Department of State drafted a 3-month modus vivendi, according to which Japan would start a token withdrawal from Indochina and America, would partially resume trade with Japan, as a preliminary to a fresh approach to the China problem. Of the friendly governments to which this was submitted on 25 November, Chiang Kai-shek violently opposed it, and the British, Dutch, and Australian governments were lukewarm or unfavourable. Many people high in the United States government, too, thought that this proposal smelt of Munich. The President decided, on Hull's advice, that the slight prospect of Japan's agreeing to this modus vivendi did not warrant the risks to Chinese and American morale that backtracking at this time would involve. Actually, Tojo had already rejected the essential idea of the modus vivendi, halting conquest in return for oil, in a dispatch of 20 November, so the whole thing was bad diplomacy. Hull's next move was even less fortunate. On 26 November, he presented to the Japanese ambassadors at Washington an outline of a proposed basis for agreement which went absolutely counter to Tojo's plans, for it required an eventual Japanese evacuation of China and recognition of Chiang in return for restoration of trading relations with the United States. While such stipulations made no sense at that crisis, it must be emphasized that this note was not an ultimatum, an alternative to war. There was no threat, express or implied, that the President would ask for a declaration of war on Japan if Tojo rejected it. The Cold War could have gone on indefinitely, so far as Washington was concerned, and we now know how long a Cold War can go on, provided Japan made no fresh aggressive move, and it is doubtful whether Congress would have considered as casus belli a Japanese move into Thailand, British Malaya, or the Netherlands East Indies. On 26 November, the very day that Hull's outline was presented, the Japanese striking force for Pearl Harbor sorted from Tankan Bay in the Kuriles. The day of infamy was already set for 7 December, and several other Japanese task forces were set in motion to strike or invade Hong Kong, Malaya, Thailand, and the Philippines. If Washington had knuckled under completely before 5 December, the Pearl Harbor force would have been recalled, but the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the Netherlands East Indies would have gone on according to schedule. Those were Japanese objectives from which they could not have been dissuaded, no matter how abject the appeasement. History is studded with ironies, but never were there greater ironies than these. The fundamental reason for America's going to war with Japan was our insistence on the integrity of China. Yet all our efforts and sacrifices, instead of strengthening friendly relations with China, have resulted in making her our greatest potential enemy. America in 1939 to 1941 wanted neither world power nor world responsibility, only to be let alone. But world power and responsibility were forced upon her by the two nations, Germany and Japan, that badly wanted both. And those nations are now numbered among America's firmest allies. In terms of the ancient Greek drama, the gods of Olympus must be roaring with laughter over the state of the world 20 years and more after the Pearl Harbor attack, which one might think had been especially arranged by them to destroy American complacency. The Pearl Harbor striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was strong, well-organized, and intensively trained for the double purpose of wiping out the major part of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and destroying all military aircraft on Oahu. It included the 6 newest and largest carriers of the Imperial Navy, a screen of 9 destroyers and a light cruiser, a support force of 2 battleships and 2 heavy cruisers, 3 fleet submarines to patrol the flanks, and a supply train of 7 or 8 tankers. These ships departed the inland sea in deuces and trays so as not to arouse suspicion, rendezvoused at desolate Tankan Bay in the Kuriles, and sailed for Pearl Harbor 26 November. Course was shaped over a part of the North Pacific generally avoided by merchant shipping, and the advance screen of destroyers was ordered to sink at sight any American, British, or Dutch vessel encountered. The weather was foul. Many men were washed overboard. Fueling at sea was accomplished with difficulty, but striking force pounded along according to schedule. Admiral Nagumo did not relish his assignment and rather hoped that his force would be detected by 5 December, in which case Yamamoto had instructed him to abandon mission and return. But only one ship, a Japanese freighter, was encountered, and not one aircraft. By listening to the Honolulu commercial broadcasts, the Admiral was assured that nobody ashore anticipated the lethal strike that he was about to deliver. His sailors had been hopped up by anti-American propaganda to a black, bitter hatred of Americans, and it apparently never occurred to anyone that to attack an unsuspecting people, when your government was still negotiating, and in defiance of the Hague Convention of 1907 which Japan had ratified, was dirty ball. Treaties for the Japanese government of that time were to be honoured or broken according to the Emperor's presumed interest. Early on 6 December, the latest report from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu on American ships present in Pearl Harbor was received via Tokyo. The battle fleet was there all right, but no carriers, a great disappointment. At 9 p.m. that evening, striking force reached the meridian of Oahu at a point about 490 miles north of the island. All hands on the carriers who could be spared from duties below were summoned to the flight decks. Officers made speeches, and the actual flag which had been displayed from Admiral Togo's flagship before the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 was raised to the masthead of Akagi. It was a high moment of frenzied, patriotic emotion. Course now was shaped due south. The oilers and supply ships were left behind, and during a night of thick overcast through which the moon, 3 days after full, showed a faint light, striking force charged forward at 26 knots. Heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, thrust ahead to catapult 2 float planes for reconnaissance. They reported everything calm in Pearl Harbor, not one ship underway. Nagumo reached his launching point, latitude 26° north, longitude 158° west, about 275 miles north of Pearl Harbor, at 6 a.m. It was still dark, and the carriers pitched badly in the swell, but the launching of the first attack was effected without mishap, and the 183 planes orbited waiting for their strike commander, Captain Fuchida, to give the word to go. Again, emotion welled high in Japanese breasts. All who could came topside and shrilled banzai into the grey dawn. First blow of Japan against the United States was scheduled not for the Emperor's Eagles, but for his advance expeditionary force of submarines. These, 27 in number, left Kura and Yokosuka around 19 November and fueled at Kwajalein in the Marshalls. 5 of the I-boats carried midget two-man submarines. These had the mission of penetrating Pearl Harbor, while the big ones took stations on 6 December about Oahu, to torpedo any American ship that escaped the airstrike. The midgets were cast off at midnight 6 to 7 December, a few miles outside the harbor's mouth. Before taking up the story of what happened on that day of infamy, let us see what the high commands at Hawaii and Washington were doing to prevent surprise. The answer is almost nothing. Admiral Stark in Washington sent Admiral Kimmel in Pearl Harbor a war warning on 27 November to expect an aggressive move by Japan within the next few days against either the Philippines, Tai, Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo. He ordered Kimmel to prepare to execute defensive deployment preparatory to carrying out the existing war plan. The Chief of Naval Operations did not mention Hawaii as a possible target, and neither Admiral Kimmel nor Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanding the army in Hawaii, believed it to be menaced. They did not even notify the commanders of their respective air arms, Rear Admiral Bellinger and Brigadier General Martin, of the war warning dispatch. There had been no Army-Navy air raid drill since 12 November. On 2, 3, 4 and 5 December air patrols were sent out as much as 400 miles to the northwestward, not with any idea of discovering an enemy, but to train pilots and break in new PBY Catalinas. But on the 6th, the air reconnaissance was again reduced to little more than harbour mouth patrol. General Short took the war warning as indicating danger only from local sabotage, and ordered all Army planes to be parked wing to wing. He so informed Washington, but owing to a recent renumbering of the 3 degrees of alert, Washington assumed that his alert was complete instead of local. In general, routine patrol and training schedules were maintained after 27 November, and the usual leaves and liberties were granted for that weekend and the next. Pearl Harbor and Oahu were unprepared, mentally and physically, for what happened on the 7th. As one officer expressed it, there was a state of mind of being fed up with the unproductive vigilance of the several months preceding. One very important new measure Admiral Kimmel did take in good time. On 28 November, he sent Carrier Enterprise from Pearl Harbor under Rear Admiral Halsey to deliver Marine Corps fighter planes to Wake Island, and Halsey, to his credit, ordered his men to shoot down any suspicious ships or planes encountered. On 4 December, Halsey delivered the planes, and on the 7th was on his way back to Oahu. Also, on 5 December, Admiral Kimmel sent a task force built around Carrier Lexington under Rear Admiral Newton to deliver 25 scout bombers to Midway Island. Saratoga, the 3rd Pacific Fleet carrier, had left Pearl Harbor for upkeep and repairs on the west coast. Thus, the 3 carriers, whose destruction would have been far more disastrous than that of the entire battle fleet, were absent on 7 December, a slight concession that the god of battles made to us on that fateful day. Now let us turn to Washington there. Army and Navy intelligence had been reading the Japanese mail, intercepting, decrypting and translating dispatches between Tokyo and its representatives in Washington and elsewhere. These told them that war was likely to break out in the Far East on the weekend of 29 November. But whereabouts, or on what date, the Japanese government was too cagey to admit even in the top-secret diplomatic code. Every bit of intelligence received from this and many other sources was ambiguous. Neither date nor target was mentioned. And when Sunday, 30 November, passed and nothing happened, a sort of numbness seemed to creep over official Washington. Commander Arthur H. McCollum of the Office of Naval Intelligence felt that the situation was serious enough to send another war warning to Hawaii on 4 December, but Admiral Stark declined to do so, felt there had been too much crying wolf. The 2 Japanese dispatches decrypted and translated before 7 December, which might have suggested an attack on Pearl Harbor. These were orders from Tokyo to an agent in Honolulu to report not only all ship movements in and out of Pearl Harbor, but where each ship was berthed within the harbor. Admiral Kimmel might have perceived the significance of these now famous berthing orders, but he never had the chance. Naval intelligence discounted them because similar orders were being sent to Japanese agents in all principal world ports, and in that context, these particular demands on Honolulu no more indicated an attack on Pearl Harbor than an attack on San Diego, the Panama Canal, New York, London, Rio, or Sydney. Nevertheless, the failure to transmit this material to Pearl Harbor is a black mark against Washington. One may argue, as Admiral Turner did at the hearings, that the 27 November war warning should have been enough to put Kimmel on his toes. But as Roberta Wallstetter well says, there seems little doubt that if the sender had been more alarmed, the warning itself would have been more alarming. On Saturday, 6 December, Tokyo began transmitting to its Washington embassy in diplomatic code a long note for the State Department, breaking diplomatic relations. Army intelligence had the first 13 parts decrypted, translated, and in the hands of Brigadier General Sherman Miles, head of Army Intelligence, and Captain Theodore S. Wilkinson, head of Naval Intelligence, by 10:30 a.m. These 13 parts were a long rehash of Japanese-American relations, accusing us of warmongering in East Asia. President Roosevelt received and read them that evening and exclaimed, "This means war," but the note gave no hint of a projected attack on Hawaii or anywhere in particular. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, were not informed that evening by the officers whose duty it was to do so. Admiral Stark and Rear Admiral Turner, the Navy War Plans Chief, were in Stark's office at 9:15 a.m. Sunday, 7 December, when Captain Wilkinson, Chief of Naval Intelligence, and Commander McCollum, head of his Far East section, brought in the translation of Tokyo's Part 14, the snapper which broke off diplomatic relations. But even Part 14 did not declare war or threaten immediate attack. About an hour later, Commander McCollum brought in the time of delivery message, an order from Tokyo to its ambassadors to destroy all coding machines after presenting the 14-part note to Secretary Hull at 1 p.m. Sunday was an odd day, and 1 p.m. a strange hour for presenting a diplomatic note. What could it mean? McCollum and his assistant, Lieutenant Commander A.D. Kramer, and Colonel Rufus S. Bratton of Army Intelligence, guessed the answer by consulting a time chart on the wall. 1 p.m. in Washington was 7:30 a.m. at Pearl Harbor. That might be only a coincidence, but it might also mean an attack there, and there only, for 1 p.m. in Washington, is nighttime at Manila and Guam. Wilkinson suggested that Admiral Stark at once call Admiral Kimmel on the telephone. Stark demurred, feeling that since the Army was responsible for the defense of Hawaii, General Marshall should do it. Marshall, contacted on returning from his Sunday morning horseback ride, came into Stark's office at about 11:15 a.m. In tense silence he read all 14 parts, agreed that they meant immediate war, and that Pearl Harbor and Manila should be alerted at once. Marshall's communicator said he could get the word to Pearl in 20 minutes. Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, Director of Naval Communications, offered to send it through Navy channels. Stark declined, again Navy-Army punctilio, and the message, just what significance the hour set may have we do not know, but be on the alert accordingly, was filed at noon, 6:30 a.m. in Hawaii. General Marshall called the Army Communications Center thrice to make sure that the message had been filed and sent, and was assured that it had been sent, which it had, but by Western Union. There was a foul-up that morning in Army radio, and the officer in charge entrusted the message to commercial channels. A boy on a bicycle delivered it to General Short some hours after the attack was over. The night of 6 to 7 December was not uneventful in and around Oahu. While officers and men on leave enjoyed themselves in Honolulu, as sailors do on a Saturday night, a routine patrol was maintained off Pearl Harbor entrance. At 3:55 a.m., USS Condor sighted a periscope less than 2 miles offshore and passed the word by blinker to Destroyer Ward, also on patrol. The two captains discussed the contact by radio. Their talk was overheard at Bishop's Point radio station ashore, but nobody there thought it worthwhile to relay this to naval headquarters, nor did the captains. Almost 3 hours passed, and Pearl Harbor slept. At 6:33 a.m., a patrolling Catalina sighted the same or another midget submarine, dropped smoke pots on the spot, and informed Ward. The destroyer closed, shot at, depth-charged, and sank the midget at 6:45 a.m. Ward's commanding officer, Captain Outerbridge, sent the word at 6:51 a.m. to Naval District Headquarters where, owing to an unexplained delay, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky, the duty officer, never got it until 7:12 a.m. Kaminsky, one of the few communicators really on the ball that morning, made frantic efforts to pass this word to Fleet Headquarters, but he had only one telephone operator, a Hawaiian who spoke little English, and found it difficult to raise anyone at that hour of a Sunday morning. In the meantime, at 7 a.m., another PBY had sunk a second midget a mile off Pearl Harbor entrance, but, contrary to instructions, reported the incident in code. So, this message was not ready for circulation until 7:30 a.m., when the Pacific Fleet Staff Duty Officer telephoned it to Rear Admiral Bellinger's operations officer at Ford Island. They discussed these reports over the telephone with Admiral Block, the Naval District Commandant. All three, who suspected these contacts to be false, were still talking about them when the bombs began to drop. Thus, the Navy, largely through faulty or lax communications, lost an opportunity to alert the fleet that midget submarines were lurking about Pearl Harbor in the early morning. Admiral Kimmel himself, on 14 October, had warned the fleet that a single submarine attack may indicate the presence of a considerable surface force probably composed of fast ships accompanied by a carrier. But this was embedded in a very prolix and involved fleet letter, which nobody except Kaminsky appears to have digested, and the Army lost an even better chance to give advance warning of the main air attack. It was responsible for 5 or 6 mobile search radar stations spotted around the coast of Oahu. Search radar had saved England from destruction during the German air blitz of 1940, and it might have done so here, but these Army radars were being operated on Sunday only from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., and at all times on a training basis to train radar operators, not with any serious idea of watching for enemy aircraft. The radar set at Opana on the northern point of Oahu was manned on the morning of 7 December by Privates Lockard and Elliott. Between 6:45 a.m. and 7 a.m., they tracked what we now know to have been a Japanese cruiser plane reconnoitering ahead of the bombers to make sure that the battle fleet was really in harbour. One of the lads reported this to Radio Information Centre at Fort Shafter near Honolulu, where the duty officer was an inexperienced second lieutenant, also under training. He ordered them to secure for the day. Instead of so doing, the two privates, eager to improve their technique, continued to work the radar. Elliott, at the controls at 7:02 a.m., saw on the screen something completely out of the ordinary, blips indicating an enormous flight of planes, bigger than anything he had ever observed. The flight was then 132 miles north of Oahu, approaching at 182 miles per hour. He telephoned the switchboard operator at the information centre, who insisted on calling the duty officer to hear what the privates had to say. The Green Lieutenant listened in a bored manner and told them to forget it, for he had heard that a flight of our B-17s was expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. But these could only have been a dozen planes at most, and the Opana radar screen showed a flight numbering over 100. Note that if even one of the people responsible, either in Washington or on Oahu, had been really brisk, the fleet and army could have had at least an hour's warning, and hundreds of lives would have been saved.